Welcome everybody, thank you, to this final plenary, and also to thank everybody for coming along today and contributing. My name's Sharon Campion, I'm a rep in Samuel Unison, which is just kind of north of Birmingham. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant and inspirational day. I think we want to thank the NEU in particular for allowing us to have the event in this venue, and also all the trade unions that have sponsored the event today. I came to this event last year, and everybody that you can say it's definitely much bigger than it was last year, so it has been a very great success. Okay, just to say we have had people in the workshops taking notes of what the initiatives are going to be, and we're actually going to put them up on the Stand Up to Racism website next week, and we will want people to share those as widely as they can, really, to try and build that anti-racist movement. Just to say, unfortunately, I've had a message from Claudia Webb, who was going to be the co-chair with myself. Claudia's an Islington councillor, and she's also on the Labour Party NEC. She's been at the Labour's Democracy Commission meeting in Brighton, and that's overrun, and she's not going to be able to get here on time, so that's unfortunate. She has actually given me something to read out, so I hope I can read this writing before I introduce our brilliant lineup of speakers. So Claudia said, "I've heard of the brilliant attendance at your conference, and this must be part of an ongoing campaign to take the anti-racist movement feeling into the trade union movement and to win their widespread support. After all, trade unions have a proud anti-racist tradition going back to the American Civil War. I also urge every one of you to build as widely as possible for the demo on the 17th of March. It needs to be a strong and powerful expression of anti-racism, which will give confidence to anti-racists across the UK. Solidarity to everyone." Okay, we've got a brilliant lineup of speakers, so I'm going to start straight away with Weyman Bennett, who's the co-chair of Stand Up to Racism. Weyman.
I want to start off by saying what a brilliant conference this is. And it's not a brilliant conference because of particularly who's speaking, although I am surrounded... No, I don't mean it like that. I am surrounded by, the leaders of the trade union movement, the people that have stood up for show racism the red card, for people that stood up for people in Grenfell, for the leaders of the TUC. I'm glad to stand amongst you to say that the most important question is how we fight today to change the problems of our world. I've never been so angry, actually, to be honest. I mean, I've never seen things... I thought that in the 21st century, I'd never see the kind of things that are taking place now. The fact that people are saying that women can't dress and wear a hijab at school and pretending that it's about freedom when it's about restriction. That's what it's about. We have to stand with the Muslim community. The death of Rashan Charles, the murder that's taken place, and nobody is held responsible for it. The richest borough in the country where people are burned to death, while people like Carillion get away with carrying out these attacks. And what I'm driven to is, I was speaking to somebody from a campaign against academies inside Newham today, and she was saying that, what do we do about it? Because, we need to make sure our voice is heard. And I want to argue that we need to march, and we need to resist. And I want to say that we stand in a tradition. Frederick Douglass left the United States to make a speech in the United Kingdom. You know why he made the speech in the United Kingdom? He came to talk to the trade unions movement. He actually came to talk to the Irish Chartists as well, that were part of the movement. And one of the speech that he made at the time, and I'm going to repeat it. He said, "Let me tell you a word about the philosophy of reform. The whole of history, the progress of human liberty, shows that all concessions yet to be made are against struggle, against earnest conflict. The conflict may be exciting, agitating, all-absorbing, and for the time, put all struggle and make all tumults silence. But if there's to be freedom, we have to struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Those who profess freedom and yet depreciate agitation are not humans who want crops without ploughing up the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of the waters. It may be a moral struggle. It may be a physical struggle. But it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. And our demand is very, very simple. Our demand is this, that the people that run our society, the Theresa Mays, the people that preside over the levels of racism and discrimination, I'm glad to support Care for Calais' call for the refugees fighting inside Calais. When they put a picture and say that somebody's been shot inside Calais and they treat people like animals, the only thing that cheered me up this week was seeing Hopkins arrested for the incitement for racial... and I've never normally called for someone's passport to be taken away from them. I think that they should be, but I was glad to see her passport taken away. I think she's permanently on ketamine, actually, in terms of what's taken place. But the other thing we've seen is the people at the top of our society, Donald Trump. We have to march because of people like Donald Trump. Because what happened in Charlottesville, it sends a shudder down my back that you now see the shadow of the fascists starting to reappear across Europe. The AFD, the FPO, there are too many of these people, and we know where it led. UAF led a trip to Auschwitz, and when you go to the death camps, we have a slogan of never again. And I don't believe that you stay at a level of pessimism. The real question is organisation. When we went there, we came there, and you know who was coming back on the plane? Nick Griffin. Nick Griffin was on the plane. But one thing I'm glad to say, Nick Griffin wasn't Nick Griffin MEP. He wasn't even Nick Griffin councillor. He wasn't Nick Griffin anything, because we kicked him into the dustbin of history. We kicked him into the dustbin of history. And we have to do that. And that fight, actually, when people say it's the top society that matters, I tell you what really matters is what people do in their work, where they live, and in their communities. When you see the NHS attacked, and they turn around and say it's health tourists that are breaking it down, no, it's not, it's Hunt. I mean, it's the people at the top of society who are pillaging and destroying our lives and encouraging people to divide and fight against us. How are we supposed to change this? What I think has been brilliant about listening to all the talks today is that people are organising on the ground. We have to march. It is the anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King. And when people say you can't change anything, it was a trade unionist, Rosa Parks, a black woman seamstress, who refused to give up her seat because she refused to be second class, that started the movement. And let's give thanks to the suffragettes. But I want to give thanks to Sylvia Pankhurst, actually. Because people never mention Sylvia Pankhurst. They don't mention Sylvia Pankhurst. You know why? Because he's the unacceptable face of the struggle. And Sylvia Pankhurst, you know where she died? She died in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. You know why she died there? She died there continuing a fight against racism and the Nazis and against what Mussolini stood for. We want to remember Sylvia Pankhurst. She fought for the right of women to vote, but she fought for a better society. And that's why we march. Because every time we march, we see our own strength. We see the people. We see ourselves. When they talk about they speak for us, they don't speak for us. If you go, some of the people have said they're worried about if a young woman should wear hijab. I don't believe they know any Muslim community. I don't believe they know it. They've read about it. They've done a policy report, right? They've had a focus group. But they don't actually know. Our class is actually mixed. When Frederick Douglass came here, he came and spoke to the trade unions. And what he said was that we have to have a common struggle if we're going to break through. And that common struggle means on the 17th of March, all the bits have to come together. You see, the other shocking thing this week was what happened with the Daily Telegraph. I don't know if people read the report. You know what the report's about? The report's about Brexit, essentially. But, you know, it talks about George Soros being a billionaire. I'm not a friend of billionaires unless they're giving money to stand up to racism, and if there's anybody out there, I'll take their money and condemn you later, right? But the point about it is, right, what did they say about George Soros? They made a link about George Soros because he's Jewish. Now, think about that for a moment. That has not happened since the end of the Second World War, where someone's political position is determined by what their religion is. Because what we're seeing with the rise of Islamophobia is a rise of every other racism. We're seeing a rise of that. That's the reason why we're seeing people being openly anti-Semitic. That's the reason why the Hungarian government is turning around and the Polish government is turning around and saying that the Holocaust was not a Holocaust caused by the Nazis and fascists, it was caused by people being German. And actually what we want to witness and what we have to do is to begin to use the roots that we have in order to make sure that a struggle takes place that means that we can defeat those people that want to stop us. We want to march on the 17th of March. We want to take over the streets. We want to make sure we're going to march down on to where Theresa May lives. She may not live there for very long. I would like Jeremy Corbyn to be the next person inside number 10. But I tell you what, it's not enough to put somebody inside number 10 if we don't control the streets, we don't control our own factories, we don't control where we live inside our own communities. And for that to happen, that only happens when people come out and protest, when they come out and make their voices heard. And that's why I want people to make sure the demonstration is a big one. But I tell you why I also want to make it a big one, is because as a privilege of working for Stand Up to Racism, I've been allowed to visit most of the countries across Europe. And every time I go there, there's a Nazi coming up to me saying, one Nazi came up to me in Austria and said, when we come into power, we're going to liquidate people like you. Calmly, in a suit and a floppy hat, right? Now, the reason why I think we should make sure, we have to support our brothers and sisters internationally, because they're marching in Poland against those people. They're marching in Austria. They're marching inside France. They're marching in Greece. They're marching all over the world. They're marching in Cardiff. They're marching in Scotland. But what we have to do is to make sure that our voices are heard, to make sure that that demonstration on UN anti-racism is marked. I also want to make sure that it's marked for somebody else. There was a young man that died in Grenfell. He survived marching across the Sahara. He survived crossing the sea to come to here, to be a steward on the demonstration, and he lost his life in Grenfell Tower. I think we have to march for refugees. I think we have to say, when people say that people aren't welcome here, we have to say they're welcome here. Because the trick of using divide and rule and immigration as a key is what they're trying to do. Everybody, we have to march to make sure that what happened in history doesn't get repeated and that it never again becomes not just a watchword that's left behind. I want people like the Nick Griffins to be pushed back so they don't belong. And the final warning I want to say is that they're not alone. There's people like the FLA who've decided to organise inside the colleges. And we can defeat these people. Why can we defeat them? Because when black, white, Jewish, gay, straight, trans have all come out together, we've defeated those people. I remember seeing Nick Griffin cry in Barking and Dagenham because we made him cry and we defeated him. I remember. I'm going to start here. I want to destroy Tommy Robinson, or Stephen Yoxley, as his real name. I want to make sure that that guy's fat gob is shut up once and for all, because when we march, he came in the last demonstration last time. I've made myself a promise that I'm going to give him a special welcome if he decides to show his face on our demonstration. But the most important thing that matters is our numbers. It matters that we have the large numbers in order to march. So please make sure that demonstration belongs to you. It belongs to the trade union movement. It belongs to all of us. Make sure we bring everybody on there, men, women, gay, straight, trans, that we take our streets because they belong to us and they do not belong to the racists, the anti-Semites and the Islamophobes. They belong to us and our power, because when we do that, we stop the reactionaries and the rats that come out of the sewer trying to attack us. And we have the power to do that, provided we show the numbers and the organisation to begin to break them. We will not be silenced by the racists. We will not be divided by people like Theresa May. We have our class, we have our unity, and we have to use it in order to stop them from breaking us.
Thank you very much, Weyman. Yes, let's make March the 17th as big as possible. OK, our next speaker is Alex Kenny, who's chair of the NUT Equalities Committee.
Thank you, brothers and sisters. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a last-minute substitute for our General Secretary, Kevin Courtney, who's had to go down to Wales this weekend for a funeral of one of our ex-presidents, Mary Compton, who was committed to the cause that we're talking about today. So Kevin's asked me to step in this afternoon. And we're very pleased to be hosting this conference here today as the National Union of Teachers section of the National Education Union, and we're very proud of the work that we do with Stand Up to Racism and Unite Against Fascism. And I just want to talk very quickly in the time I've got about some of that work to give you an illustration of the kind of work we're doing in this area, because it's an important issue for us. It's important for us as a trade union, that we see ourselves lining up alongside groups like Stand Up to Racism. It's an important political issue, but for our members in the work we do, it's an issue that we see and we face every day in our schools. So it's a professional, it's a work issue for us every day. So in terms of the NUT relationship with Stand Up to Racism, we have just agreed, as our national executive, to give a further £58,000 to Stand Up to Racism for specific projects that you're doing with the magazine and sponsoring a trip to Auschwitz and other work in that area. We're also pleased to be supporting Show Racism the Red Card and to be a sponsor for their schools competition that you'll hear about in a minute. And I do want to say here today, as chair of our Education and Equalities Committee, I don't know if they're still here, but we are immensely proud of the work that Sally Kincaid and Sarah Tomlinson in particular have done in taking people out to Calais, to showing them the reality of life as a... Sally is here. Stand up, Sally. I think Sarah has gone to get on a train to go to Calais, but that is important work, not just the work that them going out there, but taking people from around the country, taking our members from around the country who can see the reality of life as a refugee. And that's work we're now developing in the classroom. One of the things we're just about to launch in conjunction with other organisations working with refugees is resources for schools on working. We do work teaching about what refugee is and why they should be welcome here, but we haven't done enough in looking at the experience of refugee children. How schools, we say refugees are welcome here, but how welcome are we making them in our services? And so that's something we've been paying particular attention to, putting money in and launching resources. And I was hoping I might be able to show it to you. So we're sending resource packs into schools, and part of that resource pack is some video work we've done interviewing refugee children about what it's like, about their experience in school. And it's heartbreaking at times, and it just makes you stop and think. And the bit I wanted to show you is a lovely video. They haven't gone live yet, which is why I couldn't find it. A lovely video of a boy from Afghanistan in a secondary school talking about what it was like when he first came to school. And this is hard to look at times. He says, "I'm really good at maths, but I couldn't make people understand that." So he was put in the bottom set for maths. And he says, "I didn't have the words to tell them that I'm good at maths." So it just illustrates that these people have got lives and histories that they're bringing to us. And we shouldn't just assume that they're coming with nothing and that we have to start. And it's just a really charming video. He's very good-natured about it. And so that is important work that we think we're doing. The other work that we've done, and we're trying to do more on, is work we did with the Runnymede Trust on racism, the experience of black students and teachers in schools, which again highlights really some of the work we've done on sexism. Shows this as well, that schools are a microcosm of society. We can't cure all the ills of society. We can do our best, but sometimes those ills are present in our schools. The exclusion of black students should alarm us all, and is something we've got to keep looking at. The disproportionate exclusion of black students, the number of black teachers who don't get pay progression or don't get promoted in their posts is something that should shame us all as a society, and something that we need to address, not just as an education union, but as a group of people committed to it. How long have I got?
4 minutes.
4 minutes. I could bang on forever, but
I'll tell you.
The last thing I want to talk about, and I know you've talked about it already today, but is Islamophobia and our concerns about the language that is being used about Muslim children from outside their communities, people trying to tell them from outside, and it's been going on for years, saying that you need to be part of our society, and then deciding what that means and telling people what that means. And I think it's been seen in its most worrying form recently when the Chief of Ofsted, Amanda Spielman, starts a discourse outside and tries to dictate to people what they should wear to school. And it's it's done without any evidence. Now, just stop and think for a minute. Ofsted stands for the Office of Standards in Education. So their role is to look at whether children are being provided a good education. Whatever you think of Ofsted, that's their remit, to look at standards in education and how they can be improved and whether they're good or not. There's no evidence that what you wear to school has anything to do with the standard of your education or the levels of your achievement. So she's intervening from outside, beyond her remit, really, and that's one of the things we have to say to her. But it's a discourse that started with David Cameron, talking about Muslim women needing to learn English, despite the fact that he'd cut. You know, his government has seen cuts to English as a second language classes. Started with Michael Wilshaw then saying, if children are wearing the veil to school, it's a barrier to learning. We don't know whether it is or not. Nobody has done any research into whether a girl wears a headscarf to school, at what age they wear a headscarf to school, whether that impacts on learning. And so what we say about that is, it's worrying because it's the background noise to loads of other Islamophobic stuff that we see happening. But these things should be, I think there is a discussion to be had about school uniform, to be had about what children wear to school. But that's a discussion that should be happening within a school community with the parents. It shouldn't be someone outside suddenly on a whim saying, you stop wearing that, and if you are wearing that at school, we're going to start quizzing you about it. And then she shows no signs of slowing up on this. This week, she started talking about wearing the veil as the start of a journey to extremism. Now, that is just pushing the community that she says she wants to engage with. It's just pushing people away, isn't it? So we have to put a stop on that, and we have to challenge that where it comes. Now, I've been given a minute, and that was about a minute ago, probably. So I just want to say that the NUT, and when we finally become the National Education Union in January, we're on that transition process to it. We are absolutely committed to the anti-racist cause. We're absolutely committed to working with Stand Up to Racism, and we will be with you on March the 17th. And we're taking that into our work. So my final message really is, whether it's on the street or in the classroom, we say stand up to racism, and we say it loud and say it clear, refugees are welcome here. Thank you very much.
Okay, our next speaker is Manisha Tailor. Manisha has an MBE for Services to Sport and Equalities, and is also a coach at QPR and involved with Show Racism the Red Card. Manisha.
So I'll kind of go into some of the inequalities that I've experienced in football and also in education. Now, when I was growing up, I've lived in a diverse part of North London. The only part we used to live in East Finchley, we went as far as moving to North Finchley. So I don't know any different, but I didn't actually notice any inequalities growing up, although by heritage, I'm Indian. My parents were born in Kenya. You know, they migrated to England, have been living here for the vast majority of their life. So we've been brought up, respecting British values, and also, there's influences from East Africa and India as well. Now, I didn't notice. So I didn't notice that there actually is a difference, and that unfortunately there isn't equal opportunities for people like me and people similar to me, whether you're ethnic minority or whether you're female. There just isn't. And I started to notice that when I started to play football with my twin brother. So when we were growing up in the in the early 80s, there was nowhere for me to go. Where was I going to play? Because as we know, those of you, not just coaches, but those of you in schools know that it's only very recent that there's been a huge development for girls and women to play football. But when I was growing up, there was a massive inequality. So apart from me playing mixed football in the schools team with boys, that was pretty much it. I was never going to be pro. So, and funny enough, I actually played as a keeper. Clearly, didn't play as a keeper Sunday League. Now, I then became a primary school teacher. Like perhaps many of you in the room, and as I went through the years of being a primary school teacher and started to take on senior roles, I started to notice, actually, if I really want to progress as an assistant head, maybe as a deputy head, or even as a head one day, there were very few people that looked like me in those senior roles, very few females in senior roles, and I just found that I had to fight. You had to fight. Now, a lot of my work was around Ealing when I was in schools full-time. I then moved to Brent. So fortunately, I was actually surrounded by a very diverse workforce, and it was very supportive. But when I started to notice the inequality was when my head teacher started to put me on courses. And the courses were titled Leadership for Those from Ethnic Minority Groups. So I thought, oh, hold on a minute. So clearly, well, am I different? I clearly must be different, and there clearly must be few opportunities for people from those groups. The first time ever that I had to actually call upon the union for advice in my career was a school that I moved into in Hillingdon. It was the most awful experience of bullying I have ever experienced. I was an interim headship. I passed my MPQH, and I was to the verge of wanting to leave. And the only thing that kept me going to just try and finish my interim deputy headship was the fact that I thought, we have to change this. If we're not in it, we can't change it. We have to go through some of these things. Yes, we might have to have a little bit of resilience and confidence to be able to cope in such situations. But if we're not in it, we can't change it. It doesn't just have to be those that are similar to me. It's actually those who have empathy and want to create change so that there are equal opportunities for everybody. I then made a career change because I'm also a carer for my twin brother who suffers from mental health, but that will be for perhaps another conference. I took a career change because I was trying to do my master's. My brother needs absolute one-to-one support because 20 years ago he was very badly bullied. My mum had a triple heart bypass. There was an awful lot going on. So I took a career change and started to coach. So I did a little bit of work with Rachel Yankee on her football programme, who I got to know through my work in Brent. And I started a contract with the FA and doing lots of education and football projects. That's when I actually started to notice again. And I thought, wow, where are the women? Where are the female coaches? Where are the female football development officers? Where are women in other roles in football? And I'm not just talking about grassroots and community, because it became very apparent to me, where fortunately for me, I had met Chris Ramsey, for those of you who may not know, Chris Ramsey was an ex-pro himself. He played in the time where black footballers just did not play football, received a whole load of abuse, to the point where he, at times, had felt himself, what am I doing on the pitch? Now, he's a former... He was at Tottenham with Tim Sherwood and Les Ferdinand, and then when QPR were in the first team, he managed them. But he's actually my boss. So I had met Chris a good few years ago. And fortunately for me, when I met him again 2 years ago, he said to me, oh, Manisha, what are you up to now? And I said, well, I've got my UEFA B. I'm going to be out of contract because I was coaching at Middlesex, at the Girls' Centre of Excellence. And he said, why don't you come in? And I thought, I've been fighting to try and get an opportunity in a professional football club. Now, it did not matter. I've got a master's, a headship qualification, I've got an early years childhood degree, and I've got my B licence. So what? It didn't matter. What mattered was the fact that I'm Asian, I'm female, and I'm all of 4 foot tall. That's what people looked at. And unfortunately, that is still the reality. And I say that because I'm 2.5 seasons in at the club. When I first came in to volunteer, I said to Chris, how lucky am I that I've got you? How lucky am I that I've got people like you, the decision makers, who give people like me and every other person who might be in a similar situation to me an opportunity to prove that we can do the job. Then I thought, well, how lucky are we at QPR to have then somebody like Les Ferdinand, who also has gone through adversity and understands the challenges. So then we have to think this. How do we get those opportunities? How do we create a level playing field? Well, actually, we do that not just in education or when I was in schools, not just in football, but we do that where it's the responsibility of the decision makers. They have to be open to change. They have to be visionary. They have to be forward thinking to allow people who are different to them a chance where they can do the job just as well as anybody else. There's been times where I've been to games and, opposition parents, opposition teams, what do they assume? They assume I'm the physio. Why? Because I'm female. They assume that I might be the referee, when actually there are a lot more female referees, but everything other than a coach, anything other than actually the head coach of the team at the club. I had to fight when I first came into the club because what became apparent to me were perceptions. And we think about where have these ideas and these perceptions come from? Media, personal experiences. But the point is they still exist. And unfortunately, the culture in football, but in many other organisations and industries, it is still like that. Many times when I first came in, and even more recently, actually, people not just at the club, but very generally, just assumed I was coming in to volunteer and I've just finished school. Although I took that as a compliment. I said to them, did you know that I'm 38 years old? I've actually got an MBE for Services to Football and Diversity in Sport. I've got my B licence. I got 26 out of 28. I was the highest passer amongst 38 men. I've been in education. I've got 2 degrees for 16 years. But I soon realised this is not about me. This is actually about me being in it and unfortunately having to go through that process, because if I don't do it, then we cannot create pathways for other people in that situation. And unfortunately, that is how it is at the moment. And that's exactly what Chris said to me. He said to me, Manisha, for you, you have to fight. We have to carry on fighting and we have to be in it, like I said before, to change it. So we have to be the change makers. And then what was really positive for me was to be invited here on behalf of Show Racism and the Red Card, who I also do education work for, who embrace that. So we talk about the decision makers, the chief exec, Jed, Steve Goodsell, the manager, embraces the fact that, yes, I am female, but actually she brings things to the table and she can do the job just as well as all the other male ex-professional footballers who work for the organisation. So this now is about challenging those decision makers. And yes, with everything that's been said, this is about people being those change makers. Go in, yes, be resilient, but we have to fight and we have to fight together. There is a Show Racism and the Red Card competition. There are leaflets at the back if you want to hear more. We are very grateful with the charity that there is a huge amount of support from the trade union. There is a huge amount of support from the people here, but we have to do it together. And just on closure, we have to be in it to change it. So it's been an absolute pleasure to be able to speak and be with people who are also advocates for change, for equality.
Thank you very much, Manisha. Our next speaker is Claude Juarez. He's a long-time anti-racist campaigner. He's chair of the Civil Liberties and Justice and Home Affairs Committee, a Labour MEP, and we're proud to say an officer of Stand Up to Racism.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to Weyman and all the colleagues that are keeping the march against racism at the very forefront of the struggle. Sorry, I had one of these colds. I'm not infectious, by the way, although I did sort of sidle up on the wall just to keep away from it. I don't want to give you... I've just had one of those... I've recovered, by the way, I have. So I see people looking a bit, so my voice is a bit gone. But I do want to say to Weyman and to all the organisers, I think... one of the reasons I was late was it was the end of Refugee Week for a lot of our universities. They're focusing on refugees, and there are some people who are complacent about or disparaging of the number of issues that you're focusing on today. It's a hall full of activists, of people who really care about this issue. And we're now looking at, it's almost like four-dimensional chess. We're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about racism in our local areas, in education, migrant workers being organised, we're talking about the international dimension, we're talking about Trump. And it feels almost like things are out of control, but things are not out of control. Racism is widespread, and the challenge is getting ever bigger. So at this meeting, which is why I was slightly late, and I do apologise, one of the students, this was at the LSE, one of the Italian students, I was just talking about the deaths in the Mediterranean, the refugee deaths in the Mediterranean, and he was talking about the upsurge in racism in Italy. Now, we always talk about racism internationally, and I know this is going to be one of the focuses of the marches. We are internationalists. Whatever the reactionaries and the right wing do to us, we will always be internationalists. We will always link what is happening locally with what is happening in other countries, what's happening internationally. And he was explaining, this particular student, he comes from the region where the young political activist, because he wasn't particularly far right, went into a street, took out a gun and shot 6 African migrants. I'm not absolutely sure, actually. I didn't read all the detailed reports to see whether all of them are dead, but he tried to kill all of them. And what was most interesting about what he was saying, because many of you will know the story, this happened in the last few days, was not that happened, that was horrific enough, because Italy has now become the focus of the refugee crisis in many ways, along with Greece, Germany, Sweden, and so on, as we all know. What was really important about it was, in the last few days, and I know this, I've been in the European Parliament this week, is that he has been massively supported in the mainstream of Italian and European politics in the middle of the Italian election. Mainstream political parties have actually wanted to give him a legal defence. There's a woman called Giorgia Meloni who has created a new party called Brothers of Italy, not Sisters of Italy, Brothers of Italy, which links to a historical party. And this party is going to be a major player, a fascist party, in the Italian elections. Now, none of this is new, but the reason I mention it is because there is nothing we do in this country, Brexit or no Brexit, which does not have an intimate connection with racism internationally. You know, whether Trump is building walls or creating hatred in people's hearts, whenever he does it, or whether these incidents happen in Italy, the world has become smaller, and the techniques that they are using have a commonality. And, you know, sometimes you feel as though, and I know there are activists here who have been fighting this fight for a long time. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I'm just feeling a bit down. But you almost think, when is this going to end? And the point is, it is not ending. It is coming to a higher level. Anyone who saw the front page of the Daily Telegraph this week and didn't understand what that front page was about, ostensibly talking about George Soros, funding the Remain campaign. It was nothing to do with that. If you go to Hungary today and you go to the tube stations and you go to public spaces, you'll see big posters, government-sponsored posters of George Soros everywhere. It is a new phase in a kind of racism that exists in the Visegrad countries. It's spread to the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And in Poland, where they have a very right-wing government, there is an almost new and very vicious neo-Nazi movement, which goes beyond even the right-wing government that they have. And the problem with many of these countries is they have some of the strongest economic growth anywhere in the world. Romania and Hungary are two of the strongest and fastest growing economies in the world, not just in Europe, in the world. Romania is the third strongest growing economy in the world. These right-wing governments are now growing fast. They are counterintuitive. They give out benefits, as with the Kaczynskis in Poland, and they're consolidating a kind of right-wing hatred. But it is very focused on racism. I wanted to go to Poland recently, and somebody in the Parliament said, do you want somebody to go with you? I said, what do you mean, go with me? I know I might be seeming a wee bit senile and getting a bit slow, but, you know, I mean, it is happening. It happens, you know. So I forget names, you get older. They said, no, you know, for a bit of reassurance, you know, reassurance, a bit of security, you know, they sort of spelling it out, you know. And I thought, what are you on about? Security, what, in Poland? But of course, I was being a bit naive because at some of these meetings, you know, and I was never one to kind of really think about it, but, you know, they are organised now, they're vicious, and there's a new phase and wave of hatred going on. Brexit and Euroscepticism in Britain has actually given us a filter. It's a filter which means we don't really know or really care about what's happening in these countries. We hear a lot about what's happening with Trump, but really, in terms of internationalism, we don't know enough. We're not making enough of the connections. But they know that they're connected to us because they know whatever is happening here has something in common with what is happening over there. And I know I've got to be very short, but I just want to say this point about how we should see these things. Many years ago now, and I know Weyman would agree with this, what we were saying was that in countries like Denmark, where they had the Danish People's Party, in countries like Austria, where they had a far-right government, what was going to happen is not that these far-right parties would be the government necessarily, but they would push all the political parties to the right. They would be aggressive towards migrants. They would be aggressive towards decent people, getting a society that was progressive, decent, left-wing, and they would move towards a more hatred-based society, but unfortunately doing some of the things that would keep people settled. And you see that in Poland and Hungary today with the benefit system and so on. And this has happened. This has happened. They have mainstreamed their message. And when they look at Britain, they think the same. They think that mainstream is happening in the press, it's happening with the way UKIP behaves, and it's happening with the way the Conservative Party behaves today. So my message is this. When we, and this is the final point, when we look at the 3 million, the EU migrants, when we look at the problems of immigration of the settled community, we're talking about it being Indian origin, African origin, Latin American origin, the point is we should not be divided. Because when Brexit finishes, there's not going to be a wonderful immigration policy for Commonwealth immigrants. I wrote a piece about this in The Guardian recently. It was a surprise to people that there will not be a wonderful time and a wonderful land for all of us who came in the 60s. That may be a slight surprise to people that the Home Office will not be delivering that, but that is the truth. Because what is underpinning it is racism, racial discrimination. So the fight that we have to fight is an internationalist one. It is sometimes a sophisticated one. But my clear point here today for the national demonstration is we must always make the connections between racism here, now, locally, the race attacks that we've seen and we want to prevent, the race discrimination we want to prevent, and what is happening with our sisters and brothers everywhere that they're suffering racism. That is not too big a fight. I think that is a focused and essential fight for us, and we must stay focused on it.
Our next speaker is Moyra Samuels from Justice for Grenfell.
Thank you. I apologise to those people who were in the last meeting and who may hear me repeat myself. Last week we had a meeting in North Kensington and we read out the names of those people who perished needlessly in that fire. And I tell you what, people, even though it came as a shock, well, I don't know why I say it's a shock, it wasn't a shock, it was a hurt. When I sat in St. Paul's and watched the bereaved families come down the aisle and looked at the fact that actually they were predominantly 95% black and minority ethnic. We read out the names of those who perished at Grenfell, and 50 out of the 72 are from the Muslim or the black and ethnic minority communities. And I think when you see it, when you hear it, it actually brings home the communities that have been attacked by Grenfell. Now, I think for us as a community, Grenfell, yes, for the country and for us as a community, Grenfell is a turning point. But I think for us at the beginning, it was essentially about attack on our class. That's what we felt. Working class people in social housing, not treated, with respect, not listened to. Here we go again. But actually, I think 8 months on now, we're realising that Grenfell is an intersect between race and class. And we've started to actually look at the way that the community's been treated and think about how that's impacted on what happened at Grenfell. Because the demand in the inquiry and the demand from the community generally, whether it's an inquiry or a people's inquest, is that we want the truth about what happened before Grenfell, what happened during the fire, and what happened after. And I think if you start to unpick that, you see that actually the community of North Kensington, why we sort of were a bit slow on thinking about actually the fact that there was a lot of racism involved, was the fact that North Kensington is a multicultural, incredibly multicultural community. We host Carnival. We have a long tradition, which I think may have come as a little bit of a shock to both Theresa May and the powers that be, that we didn't actually lay down and just accept all the nonsense that they threw at us, because there's a long tradition. The Carnival came out of an actual building, a race riot, that actually we demonstrated in the community. This is how you build unity with different communities. This is how we celebrate our difference. And really, if I think about actually what happened to the community before the fire, was the fact that we'd been experiencing, brother over there said it's not austerity, it's actually private companies taking away public resources. The community had been experiencing that in an all-round way that I think everybody across the country, and especially in London, had been experiencing it. We know, black and minority ethnic communities are impacted more negatively by austerity than other communities. We also had been experiencing a relentless fight against social cleansing, which again is something that's familiar to most people. We'd had spaces removed from us, closed randomly. We'd had our library. It sort of makes me so angry just the thought of it. Our library leased to a private school. Sorry, this is a working class library. You didn't even ask us. We had the college threatened with closure. We had a nursery closed. We had the stables closed. We had the 3 towers right across Grenfell, an estate that had actually been managed into enormous decline. We had that threatened with demolition. So these things that had happened before the fire were the fact that the community, the Grenfell community, and a predominantly BME community had been fighting for their survival in North Kensington. And we'd been fighting the social cleansing of the Caribbean community who'd created Carnival. And that was also part of our fight. But what we realised that actually, when the fire happened, that who was the community that actually came to our aid? Who was the community that was out there? It was the Muslim community. The Muslim community who had been facing relentless Islamophobia, and they were on the streets and up because it was Ramadan, and they were generous and helpful and provided water and provided support, and they were there every day. But the other group who were out there and supportive were young black youth who actually have been demonized quite relentlessly in the media. These are thugs, they're only interested in drug dealing, they're not interested in getting careers. Young people in our community have demonstrated, and it is one of the things that's made me incredibly proud of what's happened to our community post-Grenfell. Young people have found their voice, and they've said, we're not putting up with this anymore. We're not putting up with actually the destruction of services for our community. We're not putting up with us as a community being demonized and treated with such contempt. And they are starting to find their voice and to start to take over and manage lots of the projects that are there in support of Grenfell. But the other thing that we found post the fire, in the hours after the fire, was the fact that there were no translators. You know, if I say to you that actually 50 out of the 72 at least came from BME Muslim families, there were no translators of information. People were running around trying to find out where they should go to get help and support. And that has still been incredibly slow. I only yesterday spoke to somebody about how they could get Arabic translators so that women can get therapeutic support, so that actually families can get help with their housing needs. So yet again, there's not any acknowledgement of actually the needs of the BME community. But also, a very, very basic demand of having a diverse panel in the inquiry has been refused. I'm not quite sure why, and I'm sorry, guys, at this point, all I can shout out is racism. Why wouldn't you have a diverse decision-making panel on the inquiry when actually the inquiry is about something that happened to a diverse community? This is not a precedent that's been set. This happened in Hillsborough, this happened in the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. So why wouldn't you allow it for Grenfell? You know, so yet again, the Justice for Grenfell campaign and the community of North Kensington will have to be fighting for this to occur if we're going to have any faith in this, that the inquiry is not going to be a cover-up. We've also had last week an announcement that the amnesty for undocumented survivors is going to be lifted. That's going to impact on an incredibly small number of survivors. 40, we've been indicated. Now, why couldn't the government just have lifted the amnesty, given what actually those people have been through? If they weren't just contemptuous, mean, racist, and anti-immigrant, that's the only conclusion the community's come to. You know, it's also having an impact on the bereaved families. 2 months ago was probably the last time there was a funeral. The inquiry hasn't begun. So there are bereaved families that have come from all over the world who are waiting for the inquiry to happen and have now told that their visas have been lifted and they have to go back home. So, you know, the campaign still has a lot of fight, and it's going to be a long fight. But actually what we've realised is that the unions have given us massive support. We realise that actually we're beginning to get an enormous unity across the country, and we actually know that for the campaign to be successful, we need your support, and we need to give a big shout out for solidarity, anti-racism, and the fact that that tower had a number of people who were immigrants and refugees, and that actually we need to support Justice for Grenfell. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Moyra. We have one final speaker, but I've just had word that the Roma Council in Hungary have also called a joint demonstration with Stand Up to Racism on March the 17th, and they've stated that we have the strength to march because we're not alone, so that's absolutely amazing. Okay, I'd just like to call our last speaker, who's Wilf Smith, who is Wilf Sullivan. It's a long day, sorry. Who's the Race Equality Officer for the TUC. So please stay in the room despite that massive gaffe. All right, cheers, thank you.
It's okay, I've been called many things, but Smith isn't one of them. I think Smith is one of the better ones of them, actually. I'm not going to keep you for long. I know I can see a lot of you fidgeting in your seats. It's been a long day. But I want to do two things. I want to do three things, really. Firstly, I want to thank you all for coming. I think it's wonderful to see so many trade unionists and other people here in this conference talking about what's happening in their local communities and the struggles against racism. And that's important, that we share our experiences of the struggles and encourage each other and give each other support for the struggles that we face. Secondly, I want to say that actually at this time when when the government and various institutions are going on about women being given the vote, but as people have pointed out in the workshops, they fought for and won the vote, that issue of female emancipation was part of a wider struggle for freedom and democracy for working people. That was the roots of the trade union movement in this country. It wasn't just about what's happening in the workplace, it was about workers having a voice not only in the workplace, not only in their communities, but in running this country. And so we should never forget that actually the trade union struggle isn't just about what happens at work. It's about who controls our society and for what benefit. The next thing I want to say, I never use Twitter very much because it's not that I'm a technophobe, but I find it difficult to say things in a limited number of characters. But one of the things, they ask you to put, a sort of handle on what it is that you're about. And mine is, people who think the world has changed have not read history. And I think often we live in a world where we're convinced that, almost like social Darwinism, as time goes on we progress, civilization improves. But actually history tells us something different. History tells us it's about power and it's about a constant struggle. I was born in 1958. I know you're thinking he looks much younger than me. A year for me which signifies struggle. That was the year when the British Union of Fascism were organising in West London, in Nottingham and other places, and attacked black people in the streets and in their homes. Right, where actually the next year Coleshill Cochrane died, and it was the struggles and organisations around Coleshill Cochrane which resulted in the first events which became the Notting Hill Carnival eventually. 2 years later in 1960, and this is really important because it's one of the things about why we're doing this, right, on the 20th of March in Sharpeville in South Africa, people marched for freedom and justice and were mowed down in the streets. Right? It's a salutary lesson because it shows what a ruling class is prepared to do to maintain power and to exploit people. And that ruling class in South Africa, by the way, had its roots here. We must never forget that. It wasn't it wasn't just the Boers, right? It was the British. Right, so we must never forget that because actually, all the things we see today have a synergy with that. So the march of the 17th is really important. Some people have said to me in the past when we first started doing it, why are you doing a march? It doesn't change anything. But we know symbolism is very powerful. And the symbolism from Sharpeville was so powerful that in the end the UN declared a day against racism, right? So that the world didn't forget, right? And we should make sure that the world doesn't forget what happened then and why that's relevant now. Because the experiences of people in South Africa are the kinds of experiences that people in our communities today are suffering from. And if we're not prepared for the fight, if we're not prepared to get out there and say, we are standing against this, then what happened to them can happen to us. Because, as I said in the workshop earlier, fascism didn't die in 1945 with the end of the Second World War. And it's on the rise again in Europe. Slavery didn't finish, right, in 1830. Right? There's over 40 million people today in the world in slavery. Right? And it's part of the same power struggle. And we don't call it a struggle for nothing about who controls the resources and who controls our lives. So I'll end up with saying this. We need to be out there on the 17th of March. You need to get your families and your friends and your work colleagues and anybody that you can persuade down onto the streets at the 17th of March. Because we're not only marching against racism, right? We're marching for things. Right? We're marching for everybody to have something to eat. We're marching for anybody that needs shelter, to have a roof over their head. We're marching for anybody that needs clothing to be clothed. We're marching for justice, and we're marching for truth. And it's about power to us. We're the people that can deliver that. We're the people that can make the change. So it is about power to the people. So I'll see you all there on the 17th of May.
Thank you very, very much.